And we are the Coalition, loud and proud, outrage porn-free, civilly disobedient media, broadcasting live on the Worldwide Coalition Network here in the bunker in an undisclosed location in Providence, Rhode Island, the city we love, the city of, well, about 300,000 or so stories. We're going to try and tell a couple of them tonight. Facebook.com/The Coalition Radio, on the mighty Twitter at Coalition_radio, the mothership at coalitionradio.us, and our new sort of television kind of front end to our network programming, coalitionradionetwork.com. So we've got a hectic schedule tonight. In the 7 o'clock hour, we're going to be talking for about a half hour, 40 minutes or so, about the state of the Second Amendment here in the state of Providence state of Rhode Island and Providence Plantations. It just seems like the state of Providence sometimes. In the 8 o'clock hour, we are going to flip to some national libertarian programming. We'll be some interviewing some candidates. At 9 o'clock, we'll come back for local talk radio. Yes, we now have a local talk radio element, 401-205-3738. Yeah, just like those other guys, except we respect individual callers' judgment and issues, and we don't talk down to people. We don't condescending, and I don't believe in what I call the tyranny of the mute button. So if you start going on your own narrative, well, I'll listen to it and not shut you down because I might disagree with you, however violently. Anyone who's listened to this show over the last 7 years, as we've gone from a variety of iterations, we started at true internet radio at 990 WBOB, then went from AM 790 to WPRO 630, and then, of course, to the fine folks at Go Local Prov, have understood that there is a half a dozen or so issues of which we are resolute here. None more so than the sanctity of the Second Amendment. I am what I call post-constitutional. I believe that the right to bear arms and engage in one's self-defense against a tyrannical government or an individual bent on harm to you is a birthright. We call it natural rights, natural law. It is so enshrined in our system of justice that, in fact, the most egregious act you can commit in a Western society, that is the taking of another's life, is in fact condoned if you do so in an act of self-defense. The Rhode Island Constitution, amongst the strongest in the nation, talks about the words shall not be infringed. So let me go down my own personal litany for full disclosure. I do not believe in red flag laws. I do not believe in limitations on hardware. I do not believe in limiting the size of a magazine. I do not believe in age limitations. I do not believe that the government has any role whatsoever in the peaceful use of firearms or the use of firearms in self-defense. As my late John Fennessy likes to say, problems begin at aggression, not simply possession. The folks who are listening to this show, the folks who use firearms, whether it be in sporting or self-defense in this state, largely operate in a legal manner, in a highly responsible manner. But just a few short weeks ago, we had Brenda Jacobs on the line, and she's joined us a few times. And we've talked about the importance of training firearms for the Ute, as we say, for a few reasons. Number one, at a very young age, you begin to understand the power of firearms, the deadly force that can be employed. You no longer fear the use of firearms. You learn to engage with them responsibly. That has worked in this nation for generations, and it is only in the last few years that we find these fundamental rights under assault. And I simply will have none of it. Balderdash, as I like to say. So in that spirit, we've been watching very carefully. I am a huge proponent of civil liberties, which means at one point or another, I'll annoy or upset everybody who ever listens to this show, because I'll probably come down on the wrong side of you at one thing or another. But I believe that civil liberties are absolute. And at a time like this, those civil liberties are put in place specifically for the type of crisis that we find ourselves in. I'm not a conspiracy theorist. I don't look to these great outside forces that are moving against us. I don't give government that much credit. But at the same time, I recognize that in a society gone mad, in a society that is crumbling at some point, that one needs to be prepared. And I will not have governments usurping the individual rights that you and I and everyone within the broadcast signal of this show were born with. So in that spirit, I've invited someone first time on the show, and I appreciate him taking time on a Friday night when so much is going on in the world. He's got family and his job as well. someone who's been very, very active in the Second Amendment community, and so shame on me for not this being the first time. He is, of course, Glenn Valentine, and he is the Vice President of the Rhode Island Firearm Owners League. Glenn, welcome to the coalition for the first time. Thanks for joining us.
Oh, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Now, let's one of the questions I always like to ask is what is the state of the Second Amendment? And I guess there's so much chaos. I want to use what time we have with us to clear the air to whatever degree that we can, because seems to be, certainly not at the fault of your organizations. You folks have a political discipline, a spirit of citizenry, a spirit of civil rights, a spirit of involvement that, frankly, I haven't seen many places. But you've got to get past the government and the media and the bias of a handful of special interest groups who are funded by out-of-state interests, who are paid in several cases to be quote-unquote activists, as opposed to you folks who are homeowners, business owners, teachers, lawyers, every walk of life. And you folks really define the role of activists because you do it simply because it's the right thing to do. So there has been a tremendous amount of confusion. Can we go down the issues? What's happening out there? What's with the open stores? Give us a snapshot of what folks can and cannot do right now with their weaponry.
Well, so it started about a couple of weeks ago, when the governor made an attempt to extend the background checks. We got a call from the Second Amendment Coalition, got a call from the Police Chiefs Association. They wanted to extend the background check out to 2 weeks. And then once the Police Chiefs Association partnered up with the Attorney General's office and the governor's office, they wanted to push this out to be 30 days. And it's, we understand this idea that they're backlogged with background checks and whatnot, but that's just an example of how the system, those things should be in place prior to a situation like this, where, as you said, the Second Amendment was made for something like this. And the reason why people want to purchase firearms now in very large numbers, it's not to go to ranges and to go shoot and duck hunting and all that stuff. It's to protect yourself, and lots of new shooters. And so, I think that the governor and the Attorney General's office being, I think, opportunistic and trying to push that out well beyond what the Police Chiefs Association wanted. So right now, you can currently still purchase a firearm. Gun shops are open, limited hours and limited numbers of people that can go in these shops. But now the background check could take up to 30 days for that to process. I mean, we're seeing most of them done within the 7 to 10, 14 days. So it's not out to 30, but again, it's a dig at us. The governor certainly, threw that out there as a dig.
What's actually physically, because I need to understand the process. I'm not a gun owner myself, but again, as I've said many times, I'll defend your rights to bear arms to my death. What's involved in this background check physically that it would take potentially up to 30 days?
Right. Well, so when you purchase a firearm, if you don't have a permit to carry a firearm in the state, then you have to fill out a 4473, which is a federal form through a gun dealer. That's an FBI background check required by federal law, and that's an instant check. And then the state requires an additional background check if you don't have a gun permit, and that requires a 7-day waiting period. And the issue became, for some of the departments, they couldn't process them in the towns that had gun shops that have a high volume. One gun shop in particular was selling 100 guns a day, I think, at one point. So that background check is a state background check, in addition to the federal. And so the concern was, after the 7th day, if the background check, in your local police department wasn't done, the dealer could continue forward with the sale. But they're really conflating two issues here. And one is that the background check is separate from the waiting period. The waiting period was designed as a cooling off period, which was passed in, I believe, the early, 1980, 1979. The background check has been around since the 50s, and that's something that they were able to do back then in a matter of days. And so it has nothing to do with the 7-day waiting period. So they're conflating one with the other. It's just, inefficiency of them to be able to process these things. And so they've got, it's just, it goes to show that the process, it needs to be revamped in a way that's more advantageous to us and allows you to exercise that civil entitlement.
Because ultimately, and this is what gets lost in the sauce, as it were, you folks are the customers. There's a variety of fees and taxes and sales taxes now, and club taxes and you folks, and sometimes it can seem like death by 1,000 paper cuts. I mean, ultimately, you're paying government for a service, and yet either intentionally or conflating a situation, or as they say, let's not ever let a good crisis go to waste. They are exaggerating a situation.
Right.
Where is the equity in that? It strikes me that someone needs a perspective checkup, shouldn't they?
Right. So, if you think about, we have the civil entitlement, you hit the nail on the head. We have a very strong Second Amendment equivalent, Article 1, Section 22, the right of the people to keep and bear arms. And so we've had, the law is front loaded with lots of ways where we can stop. And I don't necessarily agree with all the ways that we do. We stop folks from, the process of how we restrict firearms, but the law is front loaded with ways to stop bad people from getting guns, and those have been put in place. But at the detriment of us putting waiting periods in, and when requiring licenses for certain things, and so when the government can't make good on that background check, when they can't fulfill that background check, and now they want to push that out to 2 weeks, 30 days, that is an infringement. You might be able to convince folks that a 3-day or a 4-day wait, a background check isn't an infringement, but certainly waiting 30 days in a time, look how quickly things got to where they are right now. And what'll it be like in a month or 2 months, and so 30 days is awfully long time to have to wait, to purchase something that is a civil entitlement. In addition to we see now, we see right now cities and towns refusing to process fingerprints for gun permitting. Now they put in place a requirement to have a gun permit, in order to carry a firearm, which our state Supreme Court has said is a civil entitlement. Yet now they don't want to process those applications because they don't want to take the fingerprints. So they put in place some requirement that now they're not willing to fulfill.
Right. And that's why it's critical to stop this sort of, and again, I'm using the coalition radio air quotes here, mission creep by government at every level. I just anecdotally, I'm nowhere near as severe a level. Today, I went to get a VIN check on a vehicle a pre-owned vehicle that I was buying here in Soviet Workers' Paradise of Rhode Island, and I was told that the police department wasn't doing VIN checks. Now, I'm never going to take a shot at law enforcement's willingness to put themselves in harm's way per se, but again, now I can't register this vehicle, and I'm being told, well, there's going to be an extension. As someone who drives late at night routinely, I'd like to just say that, folks, if I get pulled over, and that's how do I prove that that's crazy? Suspend the need for a VIN check, catch up with it later. Let me go to the registry and do a vehicle. And again, that's not nearly as important, if you will, in life's priorities as the right to bear arms, because not only are there the complexities of this virus, this pandemic that we find ourselves in, but there are entirely legitimate reasons why business people who carry large quantities of cash, while people who may find themselves the target of domestic assault. We've got a good friend of the show who's a member of the LGBTQ community, who constantly advocates for folks in that community to bear arms because they find themselves the target of an assault at a rate exponentially higher than ordinary citizens. Those issues still continue. And it is the state, it is the apparatus of the state that is getting in the way of folks exercising their constitutional right, I would say almost obligation, personal obligation, to protect themselves. What happens when, God forbid, someone violates a restraining order and that person wasn't in a position to help to protect themselves because of, again, the bureaucracy? It's a 44-mile tall, 1 million person state. God knows we've got enough people sitting around doing God knows what. Figure it out. That's what I got to say. Figure it out. So now we've waxed poetic about what, in a state like Rhode Island, where tourism and the outdoors are such an important part of our economy, we now find ourselves that are the stores that can supply guns, ammunition, training, all of that now, there's a question as to whether or not they will be, quote unquote, allowed to stay open. Now, in a time of national crisis, I personally can't imagine other than food, and I'm not even going to joke about it, other than food, I can't imagine a store that more needs to be open than folks who have a uninterrupted track record of responsibly, in a safe way, in a legal way, supplying folks with the equipment, the services, and the product they need to defend themselves. It's just really that simple. So where does our friends who are let's take the clubs and the family hunting and game and fish associations? Those have all been closed, correct?
Well, that's been left up to the clubs. So I know initially there was an order for gun ranges to be shut down, and then I know the Second Amendment Coalition, Frank Sikosha, the attorney and the president of the Second Amendment Coalition, made a phone call to the whatever department that regulates that out of the governor's office, and so then they loosened that so they could stay open as long as they adhered to certain social distancing, regulations that they put in place for other places as well. So you can still have gun shops, you can still have some gun clubs, although some have made the choice to shut down. But for the most part, it's left up to the individual clubs, and as long as they adhere to what the governor's office said about social distancing, which I think is limited to no more than 5 people there, and so there are still quite a few that are open.
Now the governor issued another edict today, which allegedly puts the smackdown on anything other than going to work or obtaining food. Do we know yet if they've continued to exempt the gun clubs, or is that still? Are we still kind of figuring that out right now, which is understandable, by the way?
Yeah, I guess we're kind of figuring that out as we go along. I mean, I know, there's there's a stay-at-home order. I don't know, I'm not certain how that's going to impact us moving forward, but there hasn't been any directive for us to not be able to go to those places. Again, I mean, it goes back to this idea that we have things in place. I mean, if folks are going to purchase firearms and want to go to a place where they can safely use them, it would stand to reason that those places would remain open. And for the most part, if you're talking about private clubs, you rarely ever find more than 2 or 3 people on the premises at one time anyway. So it certainly isn't really a concern as far as the spread of COVID-19.
Right. Now, let's get to the issue of biggest contention. I saw your post on social media today. There are organizations who are really looking to shut down the gun stores as not being fill in the blanks. What exactly is happening there? Now, you've got which organizations are you aware of that are promoting essentially the just this extra legal response?
Right. Yeah, so the big 2 are the Rhode Island Coalition Against Gun Violence and Moms Demand Action, the local chapter of Moms Demand Action. But they're really just shell organizations for Michael Bloomberg. If you go on the Secretary of State's website, you'll see the money that they use to pay for their lobbyists, anywhere from $150,000 to $200,000 a year, just on lobbyists, full-time lobbyists alone. And so those 2 organizations, the post that they put out today for us to basically, I guess, get shops to agree to closing down, voluntarily speaking, is more of a plea to sort of, I guess, to stay relevant, because the General Assembly has put, really, they're not in session right now. So all the gun legislation that they seem to think they were going to ram through this year, meaning the Coalition Against Gun Violence and Moms Demand Action, all the things that they thought they would get through this year have been put on the back burner, and rightfully so. If they go back into session, it's not likely that they'll press these bills. There's not much of a stomach for anything outside of things that deal with the economic crisis the state's looking at and the healthcare crisis. And so currently, I think that the push for those, the posts that they made, fundraising posts on April 1st, and then the post today, or the article in Go Local, is just to kind of stay relevant. And if the General Assembly does go back into session, they feel as though they can continue to make a push to get these things through, given the fact that we'll probably be limited in terms of the number of people that can attend if they did have hearings.
Right, and that stretches back even to a few weeks ago when they attempted to sort of do a blitzkrieg of 18 individual pieces of legislation, incredibly enough, in one night. And if you've ever spent time in Halitosis Hall, as I have, you understand that the arguments, conversation, discussing surrounding even the most banal piece of legislation can take 3, 4, or 5 hours. Talk about one piece of gun legislation and you're pulling an all-nighter. talk about 18. Well, by the way, what was your opinion on that? That's just a craven attempt to jam a bunch of laws down our throat?
Well, I mean, each legislator, they have there's some background on what's happening in the General Assembly. Regardless of how you feel about Republicans or Democrats, it's a minority of Democrats that are very progressive leaning, that are using this as an issue for political gain. We're the safest state in the country with respect to firearms. I think we go back and forth with New Hampshire, the lowest numbers of gun deaths per capita. We have the fewest murders in the country. And we've seen the numbers of guns in this state double in the last 12 years. 250,000 firearms are sold in the last 10 years in Rhode Island. It was about 10,000 per year. Now it's 20,000. It's probably even more, I mean, obviously more now. But there's no basis for any more gun legislation in this state. But it's simply a tool that the progressives are using to call out the more moderate Democrats like Pete Mattiello. You run down the list of Democrats and certainly Republicans that are pro-2A. They're using this as an issue to press an agenda or create this crisis, so to speak, so they can push out these folks. So they can basically have a more progressive General Assembly. It has nothing to do with public safety. And most of the people in the Democrats, even anti-gun Democrats, understand if they're not progressive, they understand what the progressives are doing. And so there's not much of an appetite for these bills. So that night on the 11th of March, that was simply, they refer to it as gun night. That's where they just put all the bills out there in one night and likely to never see the light of day because we turn out in the numbers that we do. And, there have been a couple of bills like the 3D bill and the background check bill that were kind of going back and forth between the House and the Senate, which were very likely to pass in some form. But that gun night is more of an attempt to just be done with it. I think, like I said, the majority of folks in the General Assembly have no stomach for this. But if we put our guard down, I mean, they certainly wouldn't hesitate to pass them if we didn't put up the gun owners didn't show up in the numbers that they do.
Right. And as I pointed out when Brenda was on the show, I've always admired the fact that you've got people sort of babysitting the legislature almost every moment that they're open, don't you? I mean, if you're in the main hall of either side, you just look up into the eaves and you'll say, "Wow, it's funny. There's always a handful of yellow and gold shirts up there." Well, that are folks taking their time as volunteers to protect your right to bear arms. And they do it selflessly. I continue to be astonished. I was one of the people at work who almost jumped out of my seat when I got the notice on my phone that the hearings had been canceled that day. It just astonishingly good work. My hat's off to all of you. So if you had a response, if you wanted to say directly to the gun violence group, if they were here on the show, and I'm going to make an effort to get them on the show so that they can present their point of view. I'd love to at some point arrange. It's such an emotional issue. I don't know how I could pull it off, but a debate, if you will, on the issues, not on the emotion, not on the hyperbole, not on the hype, not on the rhetoric. If I could do that, I would love to, because I don't know if it's an issue we'll ever get complete agreement on, but it strikes me that there are a lot of people in Rhode Island who make a lot of money kind of on the State House floor. And I'm going to be cynical for a second and say there's an awful lot of fundraising that goes on for a bunch of candidates based on issues that are well beyond resolve, gun control being one of them, that use that as an emotional ploy to drive up the heat and also pull in the do-re-mi. What would you say to them if they were sitting right here?
I don't know what I would say, because I honestly, in the last 7 or 8 years, it's the same sort of narrative on their side. They haven't retooled, regardless of how things change in this state. So I don't think they really even believe in the things that they're pushing. Their director has very little knowledge of firearms and doesn't understand 9/10 of what she's pushing. So I don't think I'll ever have that opportunity. I've been on shows before where there was an individual that didn't show up for the debate. So I really can't answer that question, because I don't think they truly believe in any of the things that they're saying. I think it's entirely a political stunt for them to push a more progressive General Assembly. I guess I would start with I guess the one question I would ask is, what gun laws do we have in this state that aren't working?
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think we with six, we in 2018 is the last year that the state put out data on murders with firearms. We had 6 people murdered in this state, and none of them were murdered with firearms that are on any list that they're pushing, AR-15s and large capacity magazines. So I guess that would be my question. What gun laws do we have that aren't working? And how is it that your proposals are going to make any difference with respect to reality, the crimes that are taking place in this state?
There's the constant challenge to folks, and first of all, the wording, the euphemisms are quite tortured. It's always about common sense gun control, and to your point, there seems to be an astonishing dearth of knowledge about what weapons actually represent weapons of war. Are Rhode Islanders using any weapons of war here in Rhode Island?
Well, no, and for folks that have heard me speak before, it's the same kind of story, and they probably get bored with it. But the first year we were involved with any sort of lobbying, I guess, as you call it, as people would call it, and we're not really lobbyists. We have to be registered in order to be, I guess, safe, so to speak. But the first year we went up to the General Assembly, one of the things we did is that we submitted a records request. David Reichland and I, who's the president of the Rhode Island Firearms League, we submitted our records request to the city of Providence, which makes up most of the gun crime in the state, understandably, because of the density of people. We submitted a records request for every single police report that involved a gun. And we disaggregated everything with respect to the types of guns that are being used, what the capacity was, what the disposition of the case was, what the charges were. And none of the crimes had anything to do with the legislation that was drafted. And that was one of the things that legislators, they want to hear. What kinds of guns are people using? And the folks that are advocating for these legislative initiatives are advocating to push bans on guns that aren't used in crimes. It makes absolutely no sense. And so, the fact of the matter is the people that are breaking the law with firearms are people that they're prohibited by law anyway. The majority of those folks that we saw in those police reports had a handgun, were underage, couldn't own a handgun, they were under 21. They didn't have a permit to carry a firearm. And I mean that literally, not figuratively. Not one person had a permit to carry a firearm. Yet the biggest push right now for the anti-gunners is to restrict gun permitting, limit where people can carry guns, limit who can get them, increase the discretion of police chiefs in terms of who they issue and who they don't. And not one person has had a permit to carry a firearm and actually done anything inappropriately with it. So it's a complete misalignment. So I think that speaks volumes. That they're not. What they're suggesting has nothing to do with reality.
Right. No, it's unfortunate that there's so much work to be done here in Rhode Island in terms of issues of substance that we would tie the legislature up in knots, that, again, we would artificially conflate an environment so as to pursue aggressive fundraising. It's interesting when an anti – and what I mean by this is you've got a variety of gun anti-2A organizations out there. They're all able to go to an individual constituent because of the way that they're set up and raise the maximum amount of money. So you've got 2 and 3 and 4 times, and maybe even more, who knows. We never really seem to find out until there's a scandal like we did in the Warren district, actually right near your heart or your home. We don't find out until sometimes it's too late, but we've got multiple people raising money politically based on their passionate attempt to have even more gun control. And, again, the rhetoric is white hot. The issues are confused. There's a lot of misinformation out there. Now, when they raise that money, they can then donate it to, whichever politician they choose. Now, you would think based on how strict Rhode Island campaign finance laws are, and they are very strict, you would probably say to yourself, well, that means that the money that these anti-gun groups have raised can only be used to enhance gun control. Well, that's simply not true. It just gives them another opportunity to raise another $1,000 from another person, so that you've got the situation where you've got someone giving to different groups 2, 3, 4+ times over, sometimes maxing out if they're a person of substance and wealth. And then that's used for general campaign purposes by very often folks on the East Bay and folks in Providence to advance a completely different agenda. And it's I'll keep it polite, but I guess the term I'll use, it's disingenuous. It's certainly not in keeping with the spirit of the finance laws. And if you are a grassroots political organization, or you might be smaller in size, you're challenged to raise any money at all because you simply don't have the machine set up like a variety of angles of the Democratic Party are. You're playing in a completely tilted, uneven playing field. And they use that money then, quite frankly, and Glenn, if I'm off base here, please jump in. I am not an expert. I just play one on the radio.
No, they use it. Yeah.
They use that money. Then there are people making a living, working politically, using money that's from a conflated anti-gun argument to advance a whole other host of causes. So we've only got a couple minutes left. I'm so grateful you took time on a Friday night to join us. But and I want to have you again. We'll have you and Brenda on as often as you feel it seems fit to just keep the public aware. We're going to take this recording and we're going to put it out to people. Please keep us apprised of developments as they take place so that we can disseminate the information. I worry that a couple of things are going to happen. And just give me a final remark on this. If in fact gun stores are forced to shut down, I don't know the finances of these individual businesses, and it's quite frankly none of my business. But any retail operation that's shut down like that, there is a substantial chance that they may not have the opportunity to reopen. And it is my heartfelt opinion that there are those who would like to use this as a tool to limit one's market choices to supply their gun needs, all right, by essentially doing what they couldn't use legal forces to do, which is shut down gun stores and hope that some of them never reopen. And if we do that, number one, the state, here's the irony, the state profits egregiously off of these gun stores. Now, there's all sorts of ways the government makes money off the sale of firearms. But again, we'll have less proponents, less choices, and a gun, if you will, a firearm economy support system that is going to be lesser when this is all over at a time when I feel like we need it more than ever. Am I off base there? Is that some wild-eyed concern?
No, I mean, it certainly is the case with naturally a lot of businesses, but definitely there are some smaller shops in the state that are at risk of if they're closing down. I mean, they've done very well the last couple of weeks, but if they were shut down for a month or two, I'm certain that some of them would never reopen. And I think ultimately people, anyone that's watching the show needs to understand that when you're supporting local shops, it's going to pull them through. In fact, if they do have to shut down, I know a lot of folks are purchasing ammunition online and firearms online because maybe they can't get what they want when they want. But those shops, we need to support those folks. So if in fact they do shut down, they don't, they have the ability to maybe, float their employees for a month or two. Certainly, and I'm sure. I mean, and Brenda's a better expert with respect to Pittman Robbins funds, but the excise tax on guns and ammunition, if those things are purchased in this state, that comes back. It's a 17% tax, I think, or a 10%, 11% tax, or I'm not, but it is a pretty substantial tax that funds a lot of the things associated with the preservation and conservation right here in Rhode Island. So by pushing those things out of state, you're really, in a sense, hurting the state even more.
Well. Tell folks how they can join your organization and how they can reach out to you and support you. I know that you guys had probably planned some fundraisers for the spring, obviously, like everyone else. They're off. If folks have the opportunity, even in these troubled times, to contribute a little bit, where can they help you guys out and where can they join?
Well, so yeah, certainly we had two big fundraisers partnered with the Second Amendment Coalition and the Federated Sportsmen, but naturally got shut down. So, we hold a few events throughout the year. But if they want to donate to the Rhode Island Second Amendment PAC, it's just rifirearmsrights.org. They can find us on social media. If they go to Rhode Island Firearm Owners League on social media, on Facebook, you can point them in the right direction. And we started a civil defense fund this past winter. with the purposes of litigating some things associated with the red flag legislation and gun permitting, but that's sort of been put on hold because our fundraising abilities have been sort of shut down. But certainly if they go on Facebook and just look on the Rhode Island Firearms League and reach out to me, I can point them in the right direction.
Excellent. Glenn Valentine, he is the vice president of the Rhode Island Firearm Owners League. You can find them on the Facebook. You can find them online. We've posted links to a number of the organizations over time, and we will continue to do so. What I'd like to say, if there's anyone listening now who we're going to segue now to some national libertarian programming, but in the 9 o'clock hour, we will be taking calls on this. If you're looking for an opportunity to vent in an environment where you'll be able to truly express yourself, please do so. Area code 401-205-3738. Glenn, thanks again for joining us, and I look forward to continuing working with you.
Thanks.
Glenn Valentine, of course, joining on behalf of folks exercising their right to bear arms, to engage in self-defense against individuals bent on harm or a tyrannical government. God bless them. Folks, we're going to take a quick break right now. At the top of the hour, we're going to be joining LPTV, where we're going to be hosting a variety of national libertarian candidates, and we're going to be focusing on some of their concerns, the challenges they're facing campaigning in the era of Corona. If you're listening to us for the first time, if you could take a moment, like us at facebook.com/The Coalition Radio. Follow us if you're a Twitter person at Coalition_radio. Bookmark CoalitionRadioNetwork.com, because we are the Coalition, outrage porn free, civilly disobedient media broadcasting live on the worldwide Coalition Network at CoalitionRadioNetwork.com. Folks, stay tuned. We'll be back in just a couple minutes.